Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. English 12th. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. Chapters 1, 2, 3. Short questions. All Punjab boards. Previous annual papers of Lahore, Multan, Gujranwala, Sargodha, Rawalpindi, Sahiwal, Faisalabad, Bahawalpur, D.G.Khan and Azad Jammu Kashmir boards. Chapter 1. Goodbye, Mr. Chips. How did Mr. Weatherby advise Chips on the day of his interview at Brookfield? How did Mr. Weatherby advise Mr. Chips? What advice Weatherby the old headmaster tendered to Mr. Chips on his joining? Describe Mr. Chips' first meeting with Mr. Weatherby. What advice did Weatherby give to Chips in his first meeting? What was happening on that day when Chips came for interview in Brookfield? Describe the day when Mr. Chips came to Brookfield for interview. Where did Mr. Chips live after his retirement? How was Chips feeling when he was living a retired life? What were Mr. Chips' feelings on his first day in class? Why was Chips afraid of taking his first class at Brookfield School? What was the best sport of Brookfield's students for their new master? How did Mr. Chips keep himself busy at Mrs. Wickett's? How did Mr. Chips spend his time at Mrs. Wickett's house? How did Chips measure time when he lived at Mrs. Wickett's house? After retirement, why was Chips passing his time according to the timetable of Brookfield? Who did make first mischief in Chips' class and what type of mischief it was? How did Mr. Chips handle his first class at Brookfield School? How Mr. Chips punished his first student at Brookfields? What was the common health problem of Mr. Chips? What did Chips do when he heard the last ball of Brookfield when he was living at Mrs. Wickett's house? Who was Coolie? What did Chips say to the son of first Coolie? Which type of novel did Chips read and how much pages he could read? What did Chips say about Coolie's grandfather? What kind of sleep did Mr. Chips enjoy? Why did Mr. Chips leave the Melbury Public School? Why did Mr. Chips not like his previous school? Why did Mr. Chips not like Melbury Public School? Which school did Mr. Chips join first and why did he leave it a year later? What did Mr. Merivale ask Mr. Chips to do? Who was Dr. Merivale? What did Chips' doctor say about him? Write a brief note on Mr. Merivale. What did Dr. Merivale advise Mrs. Wickett about Mr. Chips' health? Trace out the similarities between Chips and Brookfield. When was Chips born and when was he brought to great exhibition? How did hours seem to pass when Mr. Chips was getting on in years after retirement? What kind of fellow was Mr. Weatherby? Who was Weatherby? Write a brief note on Mr. Weatherby. Who was Weatherby and what kind of fellow was he? What was the condition of Chips' health during the last 5 years of his life? Why 1870 was easy to remember for Chips? Why did Chips not like Melbury School? How much did Chips read before sleeping? Describe Chips' first day experience at Brookfield. Why was Dr. Merivale not tense about Chips' health? How did the hours seem to pass when Chips was getting on in years? What did Dr. Merivale usually say about Mr. Chips' health on his fortnightly visits? How was it possible for Mr. Chips to live according to the timetable of Brookfield School? What did Chips say to the third coolie? Write a note on Meldrum. Why did Chips like Brookfield School in the beginning? Chapter 2 Goodbye Mr. Chips. What were Chips' ambitions as school teachers? What were the ambitions of Mr. Chips in his youth? What was Mr. Chips' ambition when he was in his 20s? Write a note on Brookfield. When was Brookfield building rebuilt and extended? What did Chips realize after his 10 years stay at Brookfield? What were Mr. Chips' feelings after he had served Brookfield for 10 years? What role did the Brookfield School perform in the history of England? What happened to Chips in 1913? When did Chips retire and how was Chips honored at the time of his retirement? Describe the rise and fall of Brookfield. What was the status of Brookfield School? What was the social and academic status of Chips? What type of man did Brookfield School produce? When did the possibility of staying in Brookfield permanently came in Chip's mind? What is the contribution of Brookfield School to England? What were the ambitions of Mr. Chips as a young man? What was the dream of Chips in his early 20s? What was presented to Mr. Chips at his retirement? What was Mr. Chips' status when he was 50 and 60 years old? What was the status of Mr. Chips at the age of 60? When did Chips get retirement and what was presented to him? What was Chips' family background? Chapter 3 Goodbye Mr. Chips. Who was Collingwood? Who was Collingwood and what did he tell Mrs. Wicket about him? Who was Major Collingwood and what punishment did he receive at the hand of Mr. Chips? Why did Mr. Chips punish Collingwood? Who was Collingwood and why did Mr. Chips punish him? What was Mrs. Wickett's relationship with Chips and what did she do at Brookfield? Write a note on Mrs. Wickett. Who was Mrs. Wickett? Describe the condition of Mrs. Wickett house. What was the condition of Mrs. Wickett house? What kind of books Chips had and read? What was published in the Times and what was its value? What type of room was that where Mr. Chips stayed? Briefly describe Mr. Chips' room at Mrs. Wickett. Describe Chips' room at Mrs. Wickett's. What was the financial condition of Chips 15 years after his resignation? What type of life was Mr. Chips living at Mrs. Wickett after his retirement? Which subjects did Mr. Chips teach and how did he teach them? Where was Major Collingwood killed? Which type of cake did Mr. Chips like? What would Mr. Chips do in the afternoon in mild weather? With what did Mr. Chips serve the new boys and teachers at Mrs. Wickett? How did Chips welcome the newcomers? Who was Wrexham and what did he tell Mr. Chips? What were the quiet enjoyments of Mr. Chips at Mrs. Wickett house? With whom did Mr. Chips share his all discussions? What were Mr. Chips' occupations at Mrs. Wickett house? Why did Chips choose Mrs. Wickett's house after retirement? Why did Chips trash Collingwood? How was Chips' room decorated as Mrs. Wickett's? Why did the new masters call Chips a typical bachelor? Like, share and subscribe my channel, Park Education Official.